This is the first lecture for Friday, April 10th. We're nearing the end of the semester. The last few topics that we're covering in this ecology class. The last one will be ecosystem ecology, putting all this together and then looking at the effects of humans on the ecosystems around the world, ecology in general. So many people have such a big influence that there's no getting around the fact that humans are a major source of interaction with other organisms. Before we move to that, we're going to finish up a subject that fits more into community ecology. So remember, we've been following this hierarchy in this class. At the beginning of the semester, we were looking at organisms and how organisms interact with their environment. Then we looked at populations, different characteristics of populations, properties of populations. And then we started looking at communities, interactions that take place in communities, different characteristics of communities. And if you look on land, in the water, it's a little different. There aren't such drastic boundaries sometimes. But if you look in terrestrial communities, there are some major community types around the world on land. Different continents, different areas of the world, very distinct, not necessarily the same species, but similar types of communities that are dominated by certain types of vegetation. And that's where we are now, and that is going to be the last part of this, what could be classified as community ecology. And then when we're done with this, we'll move on to ecosystem ecology, the flow of materials through ecosystems. So biomes, in the first place, we'll look at these 5 different features of biomes. Some ecology classes, some ecology textbooks, they go into a lot of detail about biomes, and we certainly could go into a lot more detail, but we're going to make our survey of biomes not that extensive, but we're going to look at these different factors, different features about biomes. We're going to call upon some of the things that you already know, that you already learned earlier in the semester, back when we were meeting in person. Hopefully, these will be things that you remember. And it all is fitting together in a bigger picture in terms of things that influence the life of an organism, which is really what ecology is. You've got these different organisms that are interacting in different ways. So a biome in general, like I said, if you look on land, in the ocean, it's a little harder to characterize, and there's different subdivisions of the ocean that are used primarily instead of biomes. But if you look at the climate of some area, as we've done, if you look at the geological features of some areas around the world, as we've also done, the influence of geography and geology on organisms and communities and populations. If you look at soil, which we've done to a small degree anyway, these different physical features have a big influence on basically the physical conditions, the environmental conditions that you find in different parts of the world. And then, as we've seen, there are a number of responses to those environmental conditions, primarily in terms of the plants, the dominant plants that you find there. So there's certain conditions of rainfall and temperature and soil and these climate and disturbance. So if you look on land, you can see these big areas on different continents different species, but these big areas are dominated by similar types of species that respond to different types of environmental conditions that result in similar species, not the same species, but similar types of vegetation. Big trees, deciduous trees, coniferous trees, grassland, shrubs, those kind of things. And as the plants go, all the other organisms go. Animals, fungi, bacteria. So you can look around the world and you can classify land anyway in terms of these dominant plant forms. That's basically what this idea of biomes is. So you can look at communities. You can look at ecosystems as well, because ecosystems are what are, in addition to the living parts of an area. But that's what we're going to focus our attention on later. But basically, these big swaths of land can be grouped according to the type of vegetation that they have there. Sometimes there's a certain amount of overlap. Sometimes it's a very distinct boundary. You move from one biome to the next. You can look at on a map, or you can look in a satellite photo, aerial photo, and you can see this is where this one type of vegetation ends, and this is where this other one starts. And it's like there aren't fences there, but it's like a boundary that's very distinct. Other times there's a certain amount of overlap. So we can look at biomes, at least in terrestrial systems, and this will pull together a number of these different concepts that we've looked at so far. We've looked at organismal ecology, we looked at climate, we looked at these different environmental characteristics that have a big influence on organisms, and we looked at communities, diversity, and interactions that are taking place. So this is kind of combining those together to look at biomes. So we're going to look at maps around the world. We're going to look at these major types of vegetation that you find. Taking into consideration, or remembering, that as the dominant vegetation goes, so does everything else, animals that are there. And so ecologists have come up with this system for classifying major parts of terrestrial habitat into different biomes. And of course, as we saw early in the semester, plants are influenced heavily by climate. The amount of rainfall, the amount of sunlight, especially temperature, those kind of things have a big influence on the type of vegetation that you find there. So sometimes the boundaries are blurred, like I said. Sometimes that you can find a habitat that doesn't fit neatly into one of these categories. But for the most part, you can look at a huge part of the earth on land, and you can identify the major types of vegetation. You can characterize the major type of vegetation. Keeping in mind that the vegetation that's there is shaped by the climate and other environmental features, and you can identify these different types of vegetation that basically you can divide up into different categories or different biomes. So first of all, let's refresh our memory about climate and realize that around the world, on land anyway, there are different climate zones, especially that have to do with temperature and rainfall, and sunlight as well. Sunlight influences both of those things. The distribution of sunlight on the earth has a big influence on wind and rainfall and temperature and primary production and all these different things that are going to influence organisms. So we can look at maps of the world, and we can divide up the world, at least over land anyway, into different climate zones. And what do you know, if you look at this gradient of water, rainfall, and this gradient of temperature, and you plot those out on land, you come up with 9 climate zones. And there's a close association of biomes that have been classified as well with these climate zones. And it's not surprising that the dominant vegetation you find someplace is heavily influenced by the climate, and that's really what defines a biome in the first place. So let's first look at climate zones, and then we'll look at the vegetation. And if you combine those together, especially in terms of the dominant vegetation, those result in separate biomes, different types of biomes that have different names. The names refer primarily to the type of vegetation there. The type of vegetation, of course, is influenced heavily by the climate. So over there on the left of this, you see the 9 different biomes that we're eventually going to get to. We're going to survey these different biomes, but the point isn't to memorize these 9 different biomes and say, okay, in the temperate seasonal forest, it's a moderate climate with winter freezing, frost-resistant, deciduous temperate forest trees. It's not to get into that kind of detail, but it's to realize this interplay of the climate and the resulting type of vegetation and these big tracts of land that have characteristic vegetation. And so it serves the purpose of being able to look at the Earth, at least a land part of Earth, terrestrial systems, communities, and classify huge parts of the Earth, huge parts of the land, into 9 different characteristic types of communities on a bigger scale that we'll call biomes. So in terms of the characteristic vegetation, just review what we've seen before in this class, that the physical environment, especially the climate, things like rainfall and temperature and sunlight, determine the distribution of all these different species. Now we're focusing our attention primarily on plants and recognizing that plants are going to be heavily influenced by the amount of water, the amount of light, different geological features as well. So look, here's a common tree that we have around New England. It's not the most common, but there's the sugar maple. You can make maple syrup. So there's certain distribution in New England, and it goes all the way out past the Great Lakes. The distribution of this maple tree has to do with rainfall, sunlight, competition, some biological features as well. But the distribution, of course, to the east it ends because there's no more land. You run into the ocean. To the north, it gets too cold. It gets too little rainfall. The soil characteristics are different. To the south, it gets too warm. To the west, it gets too dry, and you have these more prairie-like conditions. So as a result, you've got this species of maple tree that's got a certain distribution. That map shows what the distribution is. Now, if you look at these other species that are closely related, very similar, same type of tree, they're maple trees, basically. If you look at black maple, less tolerant of these more marine influenced and colder environments. So black maple distribution is smaller. It's similar but smaller than the sugar maple. If you look at red maple in the middle, now red maple's got a wide distribution, maybe less tolerant of those drier prairie-like conditions, but a lot more tolerant of warmer conditions down south. So there's a lot of overlap of red maple and sugar maple. Red maple is very, very common. And then you've got silver maple that's got a different distribution, a little more tolerant of those southern conditions, less tolerant of the northern conditions, a little more tolerant of the western conditions. So you've got these 3 different species that have different distributions. This is just an example looking at maple trees. So if you zoom out a little and look at the Earth as a whole, at least on land, and see what kind of dominant vegetation is there, then you find some places there's deciduous forest, some places there's coniferous forest, some places there's grassland, prairie, savanna, some places there's shrubs. This is the type of thing that goes into shaping what you find in these different biomes. So to begin with, as well as the characteristic vegetation, of course, there's geological features, geographical features like mountains and oceans and lakes. Those are going to influence what you find there, as well as rainfall and light, sunlight. Soil is influenced by rainfall and light, and the geological history of an area. Those things have big influences. And there's still other things that influence what you find there. There's biological features, competition and herbivory, those kind of things. There's also just the evolutionary history, the biogeography of a different species. How did it get there in the first place? What kind of events were related to this, the distribution that you see for different species? But in terms of where you find these different types of plants or vegetation on land, then one of the most important things, if not the most important things, is rainfall. And of course, we saw rainfall was really a product of the distribution of sunlight, solar energy. The solar energy is distributed to different degrees around the world, and that has influences on a number of different things, including rainfall. Let's look at these boundaries then, biome boundaries. Now, this is how we're going to look at biomes in the first place, is this XY plot basically of rainfall and temperature. There's a gradient of temperature and this gradient of rainfall. And people, ecologists have gone out, if you look in this graph and you look at all those blue dots up there, and you see there's some exceptions off to the right. But for the most part, there's a number of different types of vegetation that fall into these different categories. So the lines that are drawn, for instance, separating a tropical rainforest from a tropical seasonal forest and a temperate rainforest, those lines draw those boundaries are somewhat arbitrary. But if you just look at these two environmental features of temperature and how much rainfall there is, this rainfall might be in the form of snow in some cases, but it's precipitation, then there's, along this gradient, you have places where it rains a lot, and you have places where it doesn't rain very much, from 0 to 400 centimeters of precipitation per year. You've got temperatures that are very warm, ranging to temperatures that are very cold. And as I said, if you plot these different types of vegetation on a figure like this, and look at what you find according to these two gradients of temperature and rainfall, then the extremes here are, there's some parts of the world that are warm and it rains a lot, so it's a warm, moist type of habitat. There's some parts of the world where it's very cold and it's very dry, and there's some parts of the world where it's very warm but it's dry. You see what's missing from this figure really is places where it's cold and where it rains a lot, or where it's cold and there's a lot of precipitation. There's not so many places on Earth that have those characteristics. So those are the climate. That's how the climate relates to these, first of all, these three different climate extremes: warm, moist, cool, dry, and warm, dry. So if you look at the vegetation that's associated with those, you can come up with 9 different types of dominant vegetation, or in other words, 9 biomes. Now for our purposes, 9, that's a lot to remember, so we'll try and break this down into 3. 3 parts, each of which is going to have multiple biomes. That'll make it easier. We're just looking at 3 major types of environmental characteristics and what kind of biomes do you find associated with those habitats. So first of all, there's if you look at this in terms of latitude, in the tropics, you find places where it rains a lot. You find places where there's an intermediate level of rainfall, and you find places in the tropics where it doesn't rain much at all. It's very dry. So if you look at those 3 different biomes there's in the tropical latitudes, there's tropical rainforests, there's tropical seasonal forests, savannas, still warm, but it doesn't rain as much. And then you've got these really dry places, maybe not right in the tropics, but within 23.5 degrees north and south. So we've got these subtropical deserts, low latitudes, where it's very dry. If you look in the middle, the temperate temperatures, you've got a number of biomes, quite a few biomes. You've got some places where it's a little colder, a little warmer, a little wetter, a little drier, and you've got the temperate rainforest, the temperate seasonal forest, woodland, shrub, temperate grassland, desert, and a lot of the boreal forest. All of those biomes fall within these temperate areas where it's not too hot, it's not that cold, it's not that wet, it's not that dry. Some places are pretty dry, some places are pretty wet, but a lot of these are kind of intermediate. And the climate is rather temperate. It's not too extreme, but it's more in the middle. And then you've got these polar latitudes at high latitudes, either to the north or to the south, where it's very cold and it's pretty dry. It's pretty extreme conditions, and you don't have very many organisms that can survive there. That's where you find tundra biome. So if you look at the distribution of these different biomes around the world, here's these 9 different biomes. Now here it's on a map, so it may not seem as organized as looking at that graph that shows the gradient of rainfall versus temperature, where there's a clear pattern and a pretty clear explanation for why you find these different biomes in different places. But if you look at the world and you consider where it rains a lot and where it's warm, then these are things that we're familiar with because we've looked at these earlier in the semester. So you know by the equator it's very warm, and you also know by the equator that it rains a lot. It's very wet. And as you move north from the equator or you move south from the equator, it gets both drier and it gets colder. Of course, there's these 30-degree bands of rainfall as you move north. And so you have dry parts and wet parts as you're moving north or south from the equator. But here's these 9 major biomes. And you should have in your arsenal of knowledge about ecology, you should have a lot of information that you could easily relate to why you find these different biomes in these different locations around the world. Okay, well, this will be a good place to stop for this first part, because next we can look at examples of biomes. And rather than go through these 9 biomes in detail, look at this biome, this dominant vegetation, these different characteristics, we can reserve our survey to these 3 major climate zones, climate extremes. We can look at tropical climate biomes, we can look at temperate climate biomes, and we can look at high latitude climate biomes. And then we'll have 3 things to look at instead of 9. 3 is easier than 9.